Listener and viewer discretion advised. This episode contains sensitive content, including descriptions of violence, violence on children, dismemberment, murder, and human trafficking. It also touches on themes of discrimination, superstition, and trauma. Right now, in parts of the world, people with albinism are being killed, sold for thousands of dollars in a brutal trade fueled by superstition. Albinism is a rare genetic condition. People with albinism often have very light or white hair, pale skin, and light-colored eyes, sometimes pink. But in some regions of the world, these traits have made them targets for deadly myth. But this is not just a story of fear, it's a story of resistance and drastic change. Peter Ash, a man with albinism himself, witnessed the devastating impact of these beliefs. Peter founded Under the Same Sun, an organization that has played a key role in drastically reducing these hunts. But their mission is bigger than protection. It's about breaking the cycle of ignorance and fear. Peter and his team are reshaping perceptions and providing that people with albinism are not symbols of luck or misfortune. They are human beings. He'll share his personal journey, the challenges faced by people with albinism, and the incredible work being done to build a future where everyone, regardless of appearance, is valued and respected. Welcome to the GoodViral Podcast. Thank you for joining the conversation.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of the GoodViral Podcast. We're really excited about sharing this topic because it's, for me, very, very interesting and very compelling. I was really a bit shocked, quite honestly, when I sort of found out about this topic. And so I'm really very grateful, Peter, to have you aboard and to have you talk to us today and to share with us about this. So basically, Under the Same Sun, right? This is the name of your organization. And so can you tell us, why does your organization exist and what makes your organization resonate with so many people?
Thanks a lot for the opportunity. The reason for our organization was to address a very significant and, I guess, very poorly understood human rights violation that was going on and is still going on, actually, in Africa and around the world. But our particular focus has been the sub-Saharan African region. You'll notice if you're looking at me that I have very white hair and pale skin. That's because I have a very rare genetic condition called albinism, or as some people might be more familiar with the term albino. So I have albinism, which means I have a lack of pigmentation in my hair, skin, and eyes, and I have a visual impairment. This is the physical reality for all people, regardless of race, with albinism around the world. And particularly, it came to my attention in 2008. I'm born and raised in Canada, backtrack. But in 2008, it came to my attention that people who are like me, who are of African descent, living in the East African country of Tanzania, were being ostracized, persecuted because they had albinism, rejected, isolated, harmed, and most significantly, in that particular case, they were being hunted by witch doctors so that their body parts could be used in rituals. So children largely were being attacked and killed because there was a belief that they were ghosts, that their body parts had magical powers. And as goes the thinking behind witchcraft, if you harness an object or an item that has supernatural powers and are able to control it, you can get good luck, success, or become wealthy. And so there was this human trafficking, as it were, going on in Tanzania that I heard about online. And I jumped in and thought, I'm a guy born in Canada. I had some name calling and stigma growing up because I looked different, but certainly never had to go to bed at night wondering whether or not someone would break into my house and attack and kill me. So that's the reason we exist, to bring awareness to that issue and to largely very practically intervene and make a difference and change things for people with albinism in Tanzania and indeed now across Africa.
Yeah. Wow.
Wow. When I found you guys on social media, that's kind of where we discovered your organization and this topic. And then I was like, this is wild, hearing about people being hunted because of, them looking incredibly different and misunderstood in lots of ways. And, it was interesting because I was looking on your website and I saw, and this might be a little outdated, I'm not sure, you tell me, but it was in Tanzania, those who have albinism, it was 1 in 1,400. And, compared to Europe, which is 1 in 20,000. It's a pretty large amount of people in a country to have albinism. And, I also saw that The Guardian did an article, this was a while ago in 2008, that said, there's about 200,000 people at that time who had albinism. And I was just kind of thinking, I live in a small town in Colorado, and my town is about 1,200, 1,300 people. And I was just thinking, wow, to have one in that many people, and then in a country that has a lot more, of course, that's a pretty large ratio. And can you tell a little bit of a personal story about the direct impact your organization has made with these folks, one that really showcases the difference that you guys are making?
Well, I could tell you hundreds of stories all day long, because we've worked with hundreds and hundreds of students with albinism in the last, since 2008, that's particularly the last 15 years. But I'll tell you one that illustrates the point. On my very first trip to Tanzania in 2008, I had gone to the northwest part of the country in the lake zone near Lake Victoria, where there's a large number of these attacks were occurring at the time. And I went outside the main city of Mwanza into a village where just a couple of months before my arrival, a little girl, a toddler, had been attacked and killed, and her body parts sold for witchcraft purposes. And the family was still grieving. I went to a very simple little, thatched roof home made out of brick in a very remote village, and arrived and chatted with the mom and their little daughter named Miriam. Had been late at night. Men had come. It was a premeditated attack, as these always are. They had identified where she lived through intelligence they had gathered, and they broke into the home. And she was sleeping in a room with two other siblings, one of whom had albinism, one of whom didn't. They grabbed her, and I won't get into all the graphic details because they're incredibly graphic and disturbing, but I think it's important that I tell you something, or your people listening won't really realize the importance of this issue and the severity of the issue. So I'm not going to sanitize it too much either, because you won't understand our work if I do. So they grabbed her and they dismembered her, moving her arms and legs, other parts of her body, and they gathered them together in a bag and took them away and left her torso behind. Her one older sister was old enough to see what was happening and remember it. Didn't have albinism. Her sister then had to endure that. Her younger brother was much younger, hid under his bed. He had albinism, and he was afraid for his life that if they saw him, he would also be next. Parents were sleeping in an adjacent building, right next door. There are two small sort of buildings in the home. And by the time they woke up, it was kind of all over. And so I went and visited Miriam's mom, and there was an uncle there, and there was some other relatives and friends. And they toured me through where it all happened. They walked me through the details, and I counseled with the mother and listened to her story. And they showed me where Miriam was sleeping. The grandfather was also there. And they showed me that blood stains were still on the floor of this simple little hut. And, as I say, a matter of weeks or months before. So the grief and shock and trauma was very fresh. And so I heard the story, and that was the first of many stories that I would hear over the next 15 years like that across the country, and indeed across other African countries. And of course, being a person with albinism, it moved me. It broke my heart, which is why I went to Tanzania to begin with. This Canadian guy who's never been to Africa in his life before decides that I need to help. I need to do something. And so I left that place thinking we had to do something to change public perception of albinism. We had to do something to give kids with albinism hope, which was largely through education, which we can talk about later. But let's fast forward now 15 years from that little vignette that I just told you. This family who was grief-stricken with their little girl who's been lost, Miriam, in the innocence of her life, doing nothing wrong, but simply because she looks different. Mom and dad are dark-skinned. The whole village, the whole tribe are all dark-skinned, and she's as light as I am. They don't understand why. There's confusion. And in lack of knowledge, people make up all kinds of things. And these long-standing superstitions took hold. And they believed that if they harvested her body parts, they would become wealthy. They could sell them for thousands of dollars, which is a lot when you're a poor family with limited income. And when you believe this child is not a human being anyway, because the belief is that people with albinism are not human. They're ghosts. They're supernatural beings that will vanish anyway. And so when you dehumanize someone to that extent, it's not hard to do all those kinds of things to them. But the mother and extended family were grief-stricken. The father was already gone. He was later implicated in the attack. Most often, father and or extended family are directly or indirectly involved in these attacks, sadly. And so I left from that place heavy-hearted and thought I have to do something. And it came to my attention that we need to do chiefly two things, which is what we've done for these last many years. Firstly, educating the public about these untruths, these superstitions, to educate the public of Tanzania that people with albinism are normal human beings in every way. We have normal intelligence, normal capability. We simply have a lack of pigmentation, melanin production, and we have a visual impairment in the eyes. Beyond that, we're exactly like everybody else. And if those simple differences are understood and accommodated, we can participate fully. So we engaged in a nationwide publicity campaign, TV, radio, newspaper, going to villages with our staff, educating. And then we also started an education program where we took hundreds of students with albinism. Many of them had been placed because of the attacks in overcrowded government schools for the blind. So these were small little schools built for totally blind students or disabled students. And these kids were forcibly removed from their homes and put into these boarding schools, often hundreds of miles away from their home, for their safety. The problem was these schools were overcrowded, built for 100 students, and you might have 300 students in a school. And these two kids I told you about, Mindy and Minyashi, they were similarly removed for their safety because their sister had been killed. They didn't want to stay there. And they were placed in this school. And it was a difficult school because it was overcrowded, 3 kids to a bed, unsanitary conditions, because they never anticipated this influx of kids with albinism into these schools. And so I visited one of these schools and saw the situation and said, we need to get these kids into high quality private English immersion schools. These were government run schools that were poorly staffed. The kids weren't learning very much. And I knew that education was the way out of discrimination and poverty for a bunch of reasons. I knew that in my own experience. And I thought, if we can educate students with albinism with a high quality education, then they can later gain careers and be competitive and thereby change the public thinking about albinism, which is what we did. And these students that are referred to, the 2 siblings of Mariam who were killed, they have successfully completed our education program, have university degrees or in the process of getting them, are fluent in English and Swahili, and are well on their way to a very successful career. And there's many, many other stories like that I could tell you, of kids that came from villages where they had been attacked, or maybe that kid wasn't attacked, but an attack occurred in his village, and at minimum, they were isolated and rejected and faced abject poverty. And so we created our education program for our students with albinism. We had hundreds go through the program. We still have students in elementary and high school in the program, and they're in various schools throughout the country that are already existing private English medium schools, English immersion schools, mixed with students without any disabilities. So it's a fully inclusive educational model. So we've seen a lot of our students graduate into very successful careers, everything from business to government to nonprofits, self-employment. So we have some nurses. We have one young lady who is studying to be a doctor. So we've had a great many challenges along the way fighting this discrimination, but education has been the banner, whether it be educating the public or educating students with albinism themselves. That's what we've seen as the antidote to this deadly ignorance.
And when you talk about, you shared some of the success stories, and I'm trying to think about 15 years ago, this experience that you witnessed, or that or were there right after it happened, and then fast forward 15 years. So with these success stories, are we talking about people that are able to achieve these things within their community in Tanzania, or are we talking about they have to leave the country in order to be safe, or what? I mean,
no. Yes, they stay in Tanzania. In fact, one of the requirements of our education program is we will not fund studies outside the country. All of our studies, whether they be primary, secondary school, or post-secondary, have to be in Tanzania. And our reason for that is that we want to change the culture of Tanzania. So if we take all the kids out of the country or send them to school elsewhere, you're not going to change. My motto is changing hearts and minds, right? So we want to change the way people think about albinism in Tanzania. And so the way to do that is to educate students in the country to gain it, even attending a fully inclusive school where the majority of students don't have albinism or any disability, just rubbing shoulders with a colleague who's a student that has albinism. Those kids learn something valuable, right? They play at the schoolyard together. They take class together. They live in the dormitories together, because these are all boarding schools. And so all of their colleagues don't have albinism. We may have like 50 kids in a school of 400 that we put with albinism. The other 350 kids don't have any disability. And so just the act of them studying side by side for that many years, the children begun to unlearn what they've been taught by their communities and their parents, which is that people with albinism are stupid, they have a communicable disease, they're not human. And so it's hard for them to believe that when they're playing with their best friend and he's succeeding in class right beside them. You can't argue with that, right? And so we require our students. Now, obviously, once people are adults and get their post-secondary, if they want to try and move to other places, that's on them, as it is for all of us. We can all make choices. But as far as our funding goes, we won't fund studies outside the country because our goal is to change society. So we don't educate students for the sake of educating students because it's noble and worthy, which it is. That's not why we do it. We view our students as a tool or a weapon, if you will, against discrimination. So people with albinism who are successful at representing different cultures or different careers, rather, end up becoming change makers by just living their life, right? Whether it be being a student, in university, being employed. All of a sudden you go to the bank and the guy at the bank helping you has albinism, or you send your child to school and his teacher has albinism. All of a sudden it's hard for you to think quite the same way about albinism you used to think. So education is kind of has been a large part of the emancipation of people with albinism in the country.
Firstly, I just want to kind of say thank you for doing what you're doing.
Yeah, really.
I'm really glad that we're bringing this to more awareness because I had no idea.
Yeah, most people don't. It's a very rare thing. Most people know nothing about it.
Right. And so I'm glad we're talking about this because, it can lead to, as you're saying, a big prevention, especially as the years go by, less and less, hopefully, attacks happen. Real quickly, Damian, sorry to kind of butt in, but
no,
real quickly, I also did see that, certain times is when some of the attacks actually occur. And it kind of makes sense because worldwide, illegal activities, whether it's drugs, human trafficking, poaching, it tends to escalate when there's economic hard times. But in Tanzania, it's a little different. It sounded like on your website, it was saying that during election years, these kids who have albinism are particularly unsafe. And could you just tell us a little bit about why? Yeah,
we heard this anecdotally. When we first started working in Tanzania, we heard it from people with albinism that they would often become afraid during elections and stay in hiding, not go outside. This is a trend in many sub-Saharan African countries, not just Tanzania. And largely the reason is that some of the wealthiest people in these countries, countries who are very low GDP, very poor countries in many cases, where, majority of the population are living in poverty. But one of the ways you can become rich is to become a politician. And so politicians, drive nice Range Rovers and have nice homes and get good salaries while most of the population live in poverty. And so once a politician, everyone wants to get that job. And once they have it, they want to keep it. And so when you live in a culture that believes deeply in the power of witchcraft, and Tanzania is one of those countries, people will practice a religion of some kind, maybe Christianity or Islam, but then they also still deeply believe in the power of witchcraft in addition. And so what will happen is you'll have a scenario where this guy wants to get rich, or he is elected and he wants to stay rich. And the local witch doctor whom he trusts tells him, you need powerful medicine, powerful muti that will keep you in power or get you into power. And so you'll see actually during the run up to either local or national election. This year we're having local elections in Tanzania. Next year, the national elections are happening. And we've actually been able to chart and graph a correlation between elections and the number of attacks and killings. And we know it to be anecdotally true because we'll talk to people in villages and they'll say, oh yeah, in the run up to the elections, you see all the SUVs pulling up to the house of the witch doctor. And so the other thing you have to remember is that the purchase of these body parts that are required to perform the ritual that is used to purportedly get someone successful or rich are very expensive. The data we had gathered over the years tells the hand of a person with albinism could yield $3,000 to $4,000. A complete set of body parts, they would call it, could be ordered for, we've heard figures around the $75,000 mark. And so remember, if you're in a very, very poor country, there's very few people who have that kind of money. Like very few buyers that could afford those kinds of prices. So you already have to be wealthy, either a business person or a politician to have that kind of money. And so it's a lucrative trade. And just like very much if you think of sex trafficking, all the money that's exchanges hands and all the people involved, similarly is a trade here in human body parts of people with albinism. There's a lot of people getting rich along the way. And so that's kind of what's happening in Tanzania as far as the election piece goes. And so one of the things we do is we educate. And when we're done with that, we educate, because that's what changes the way people think. And so through our education programs, which I referenced earlier, when our team would go into a remote village where there had been killings, we always targeted in our campaigns villages where killings had happened. We bring a team on the ground and we would show documentary films. We would do question and answer periods. We have highly educated, successful people with albinism on our staff, standing before village elders and community members saying, look, I have albinism. I'm educated. I'm intelligent. By the way, I'm not a ghost. I have a family. I have a life. And the ignorance would often fall away pretty quick, because previous to that, the model of albinism they had was kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. Many of the people with albinism were poor and they had skin cancer. So they had unsightly scars on their skin. So they looked unattractive. They were unemployed and they were uneducated. So they appeared to be quote unquote stupid, right? So sort of the image of albinism was someone who is covered in skin cancer, who is not educated. And so the idea is that they're unattractive, they're cursed, and they're stupid, right? Well, you can see where people would believe that, because that was sort of the way they presented people with albinism. Largely didn't have opportunities. So that's kind of, so that fulfilling that idea that that's who they are was there. And so we turned that on its head. by educating people with albinism and getting them out in front of the community.
Just want to take a quick moment. We'll get back to our interview with Peter in a second. If you're feeling inspired by the work Peter and Under the Same Sun are doing, helping people with albinism not just survive, but truly live, then check out the links in the description, wherever you're listening or watching to this podcast episode. There are so many ways to get involved. You can start a fundraising movement in your community, school, university, or even on social media. You could become an advocate by hosting a viewing party or a book club to spread awareness. And if you'd like to support Under the Same Sun directly, a one-time or monthly donation makes a huge impact. Go to their website below, underthesamesun.com, to get started. Or follow them on social media and send their posts to a friend. Every action counts. More lives saved, more lives lived fully. Now, we'll go back to the conversation with Peter.
This is really an astonishing topic, and I think that so many people are going to relate to this because discrimination is sort of everybody understands it, right? And in my lifetime, I think most people from the United States, but I live in Europe, and most people in Europe and the U.S. and around the world, we've sort of seen in our lifetimes an improvement, sort of progress in the way of discrimination, less racism, more acceptance. Now, especially in social media, it's very topics like body shaming are talked about commonly. And so it just seems like there's been such huge improvements. And then I hear what you're telling us, and it's astonishing. I feel like it's a throwback to the medieval times. It's just astonishing. So I really want to understand better. And I think for our listeners as well, talking about the last 15 years of work that you've done, but now, so when we look at what's happening right now, is it still a prevalent way of thinking? Is there still a very serious risk for people with albinism of being hunted down? Can you tell us about what it's like now? And also, I guess, connect that to maybe share with us a little bit of what has changed because of the education work that you all have done.
Yeah, what I would say is that the stigma, the discrimination is still there. I would say it exists in Tanzania, it exists across many African countries. And indeed, it exists. Discrimination usually comes out of ignorance, right? It comes out of a lack of knowledge, a belief that someone's inferior to you because you have false beliefs about them. You don't need to look further than the Holocaust in Germany to see that, because once you dehumanize a group of people and make them less human than you can do all kinds of things to them, can't you? And so that's what's happening here in a different way, right? And so what I would say is, yes, there's been a massive change. Education has created that change. And I would say that the difference we're seeing is really, I believe largely, and many people have given us this feedback, the fruits of our labor for the last 15 years. It's taken intense education up and down the country, 60, 70 million people. And so now we have situations, because now we have hundreds of students who have gone through our program, and many of them are gainfully employed, some of them in very prominent roles in the community. Give you an example, there was a political talk show a few months back. Very much like you have in Canada, the US, in the run up to an election, you'll have sort of political nerds and talking heads being interviewed by, a journalist and getting their take on what's coming up about the election. You guys in the US are in the middle of election season. In Canada, we probably will be next year. And so during those seasons in any country, there's lots of discussion on the media. And there was a sort of primetime news hour show in Tanzania, and there was a panel of people discussing the upcoming federal election. And one of the people on that panel was a guy with albinism who was one of our students who we had educated. He's a lawyer. We sponsored his high school and his law degree. What was cool about the show was that that he was being interviewed as if it wasn't a big deal, right, to have a guy with albinism either as an expert, which would never have been the case 15 years ago. Most people with albinism didn't even have grade 8, and they worked in the fields, and they never were educated, never had positions of influence, and no one would have ever put them on television, except to maybe report a killing of someone with albinism. So now this guy is sitting on this panel, giving his take on, the importance of voting and getting involved in the political process, et cetera. And what was also interesting is that during the interview, they didn't draw attention to the fact that they had albinism. They didn't say, here's so-and-so, who has albinism on the show, or albino, as they would say. It was just, here's so-and-so who's a lawyer, and here's his take. So the fact that he had albinism wasn't particularly relevant to the show hosts in that particular case, and that they would include him. So, there's a vignette from what the difference of our program makes. And there's many, many stories like that, where I would say, by and large, the thinking has changed, particularly in the urban areas. There's been more progress. Some of the really remote villages where witchcraft is still more prevalent, it's still a thing, the discrimination. The killings have decreased markedly, like massively. We've had a few in that last year or two, but in the early days, we could have 20, 30, 40, 50 killings in a year. And so there's been like an 85-90% drop in killing since we did our work. So UTSS is literally saving lives. It's not an exaggeration to say it. There are people that are alive today that wouldn't be alive today if we had not done what we did.
Right.
And the impact is spreading to many other African countries now as well.
That's amazing.
Yes.
I'm so glad that's happening. And, if when you're in the business of helping people who have the skin disorder and everything, and genetic, excuse me, actually, is it a skin disorder, genetic disorder? Am I getting my terms right?
It is a skin disorder in that the skin is affected, especially in a hot tropical climate like Tanzania. 80% of people with albinism will die by the age of 40 because of skin cancer, which is entirely preventable if you wear long sleeves and a hat and sunscreen, which is hard to find in that country. So more people die of skin cancer there than killings and attacks. So we've had to address multiple things. That, again, comes out of ignorance. Mom and dad are dark-skinned. They don't have to worry about sunburn very much. And so now they have a baby that's white, and they've never heard of something called sunscreen or even thought about sunburn. That could even happen because it doesn't happen to them usually. And so there's been a whole lot of education around protecting your child from the sun. Put a hat on them, put a long sleeve shirt on them, keep them in the shade when you can, things like that, which is why, by the way, in our education program, we always educate our students into more white-collar professions. So we don't want them working on the farm, because most of these rural communities are subsistence farming, right, where you're in the hot sun all day. So we're trying to get the kids off the farm and off manual labor jobs into offices, into schools, into government places where they can avoid the sun. So our educational path tends to send them to university for that reason, so they can gain employment in those professions.
Thank you. And that makes a lot of sense. And, I think I saw on your website as well, it was that children with the skin cancer, they can have skin cancer by the time they're 10 with early stage skin cancer. Is that right?
That's the kids that are 3, 4, 5 years old with precancerous or cancerous skin, because, I remember in one of my very early trips, there was a woman whose child was covered in precancerous sores all over their body. And they told us when we were interviewing them that they were trying to darken them up because the skin cancer would become darker in color. It might become bluish or reddish or brown, because in their mother's mind, the child was being discriminated against because they were white. And they observed that if they kept them in the sun, they quote unquote got darker. So it was their sort of limited attempt to try and make the child blend in more with the black population. And so again, they didn't understand that you're not darkening them up, you're actually giving them skin cancer, which will eventually kill them. So, our kids, for example, who are in our boarding schools, the boarding school uniforms typically are like short sleeve shirts and shorts because it's hot. We insist that we have to work with these schools and say, our students with albinism have to have different uniforms. They have to have long sleeves and long pants, and the girls have to have longer skirts, and they have to wear hats. And, it's hard for our teenage kids because they want to fit in and look like all the other kids, right? They're buddies that wear short sleeves, but I just have to sit down and get really frank with them. And I don't candy coat it at all. I mean, I've known these kids for 15 years. Most of them consider me a dad. They call me father because their fathers have usually abandoned them. Almost all of them, I'd say probably 80% of our kids are fatherless. And so having a father figure in their life is pretty important. And so I'll just sit them down and be really frank like a parent and say, you know what? If you don't wear your long sleeve shirt and your hat and you stand outside in the sun, you're going to get skin cancer and you're going to die. And, I'm that blunt with them. This is a matter of life and death. It's not a matter of, I get you like the cool fashion of the short sleeve shirt, but I'm empathetic, but here's the alternative. And do you want to die when you're 40? Because that's what's going to happen to you if you don't take care of your skin, right? And it's amazing now. The kids are to the point where I'm meeting with them for a prolonged period of time inside a classroom or inside a conference room, and they're all sitting there inside an air-conditioned room with their hats on. And I'm trying to take pictures of them, and I want to see their face, but they've got these big wide-brimmed hats on, which they're so programmed. We brainwashed them from the time they were kindergarten to wear these hats, and they actually got it. They believe it. They do it, right? And so now they don't even take it off. They don't even know they're wearing it because it's like part of their uniform. It's like getting ready in the morning. How some ladies might put on makeup or do their hair. These girls, they just put on their hats, and that's their day. And they leave it on from the time they get up till they go to bed at night. Then they take off their hat. And it's kind of a funny thing that we kind of laugh about because you're inside, but you're wearing a hat, but it's just so part of their behavior now. But it's been training. We've trained them that way. Every time over the years, I'd see a kid running around without a hat. Where's your hat? Put your hat on, kind of like a nagging parent, right? And that because they don't have parental influence, a lot of these kids, they're living in boarding schools far away from home. And so they don't have, UTSS is not just writing a check for education. We are largely running the function of being a mom and dad in many cases. In recent years, some parents have become more reintegrated with their kids, but for many, many years, we took care of the kids from A to Z, their shoes, their clothing, their toothpaste, their medical care, their books, their food, UTSS was their system, right? And so we had to take care of the stuff that families would normally take care of.
Wow.
So can you, let me see how to ask this question. So So mainly your focus has been on education, has been on helping children, students. How does this play into two things? One, adults with albinism, and also the public at large in terms of continued education to educate people. Can you talk about those two sort of categories?
Well, I mean, there's two kinds of adults. Like earlier, I referenced that we had a public education program. So that involved a series of nationwide campaigns we did over the last 15 years. We did 2 or 3 campaigns over 2 or 3 years in length, where we'd have like a theme. We'd have a whole team of people that would literally, for months at a time, almost like think of a concert tour. We had a team that would go into, and we'd target villages where attacks had happened as a high priority. And we go into really difficult to get villages. And we'd have we have a documentary film we produced on albinism. We'd have musicians, we'd have speakers. And in these small villages, when you show up with a film and a singer, everybody comes out. Like, it's a big deal that this, it's almost like a rock concert coming to town, right? And they'll come in and hear what we have to say. And so we'd have hundreds of people from the villages show up at these things. And again, having our staff members who are educated and well-spoken with albinism, looking attractive, not full of skin cancer, well presented. And then the villagers are thinking, wow, this doesn't jive with everything I've been taught for my whole life about albinism. Like, this is a whole different vision of this. Thing with albinism in Africa is it's a thing. Like, here, it's not a thing. Like, most people here don't know anybody with albinism. Like, 95% of the people I talk to don't have a close personal friend or relative with albinism. And maybe it was a random kid they saw once in school somewhere, at best case scenario. But whereas in Tanzania and in many African countries, it's common. Like, the prevalence is so high that everyone has an opinion about albinism. You have a thought process about it. It's not irrelevant. When I go to the doctor here, I have to educate my doctor. They don't know what albinism is, even, for the most part. But there, they have an opinion. Now, often it's an incorrect opinion, and it's misguided, full of, erroneous information, but it's an opinion. And so the cool thing about that is when you go into a community and talk about albinism, there's not a blasé lack of interest, because they've been raised to think these are ghosts that are cursed. Well, don't you think they might be interested in learning more about these supernatural creatures?
Right.
So It's not hard to get attendance when we show up. And it's amazing how quickly the ignorance falls away, because they can't really, like, one of the beliefs about albinism in Tanzania and in many other countries in the region is that people with albinism will not die a natural death. They actually believe they'll vanish, very much like Star Trek Beam Me Up. They're going to just dematerialize. They actually believe that. To the point where I talked to a young man in my early years in Tanzania who was in his late 20s, who every morning got up and wondered if this would be the day he would vanish, because he was taught that he would vanish by his parents. Yeah. So he actually was afraid every day that he would disappear into thin air. And so, you're trying to expose all of these beliefs and counter them with truth, with fact. And what the good news for us is that most people, when they see our staff with albinism doing well, it doesn't jive with all the misinformation they've been given, right? And the longer our program goes, the more hundreds of adults with albinism, to your point, that we have, the adults with albinism are now kids that were young kids that we educated. Like, they might have been in kindergarten 15 years ago, right? And now they're influential adults sitting in university classrooms. And so public education was part of it. And adults with albinism themselves become huge ambassadors for change just by being who they are.
And, so it's amazing that you've been doing this so long, basically a generation of work and or close to it. And so with all these 15 years after discovering the problems, seeing the problems and the stigmas around all of this, what were some surprises that came along the way, something expected that you may have gone into it knowing something and then all of a sudden realized, no, it's something different, or maybe this is working better than what you thought it was? Or what were some of the unexpected things that were good that you learned along this 15-year journey?
I believe this, person of faith. In my belief is that love can change a multitude of things. The power of love is tremendous. And even some of our staff with albinism, like our staff team was about half people with albinism, half without. And, I'd known many of them. I'd recruited them, hired them. It was very hard in the early days to get anybody with albinism educated, because very few had gone to college or university. We only had a hand. We had some of the smartest available people in the country work for us, right, that had albinism. It's hard to find a staff with albinism. There's only a handful out there because our program didn't exist yet. So there's a handful of kids that had families that were doing better and more educated that put their kids with albinism through school. And I remember, looking at these fairly well-adjusted, successful, well-spoken staff members of ours, and I get to know them fairly well. I'd spend a lot of time with them when I go to Tanzania. I'd be with them day in and day out for a couple of weeks. And just when I thought I'd know them really well, it could be 5, 6, 7, 8 years into my relationship with them, they would finally open up and tell me a story about trauma that they went through, over coffee, or we're on a plane flying somewhere, and they start telling me a story about what they went through in their community or in their school, or, and I would hear the story. One guy who was training for the priesthood to become a Catholic priest was at a seminary, and he was a year or two into his program, and the leader of the school came to him and said, you're not going to go any further in this program. And he said, why? He said, well, do you see any people like you in our churches? There's no room for this. And he was ejected. I heard a story of another guy who applied for a job, one of our staff at a company, went through the HR department, and he had all the credentials, the education, the experience, and he was shortlisted. And a common practice in Tanzania is include your photograph on your resume. And he did. And all of a sudden, he was shortlisted. He was waiting for the final interview, and all of a sudden, nothing. No response, no communication. He followed up. Turned out that once the interview panel saw that he had albinism, they dropped him. So, these were pretty, quote, happy staff who were doing well respected. And then the little tidbits of their journey would come out, and the trauma. So then we realized one of the surprises we had, and you said what was one surprised us, was trauma. We knew people with albinism were traumatized, but the level of trauma is so deep. If you have albinism and you live in Tanzania, it's safe to assume you're traumatized. At minimum, your father has left you most of the time, and your income of your mom has gone away because the dad left. So now your family's poor because you had albinism. Live with that. Now think about that. Think if you've got 3 siblings and everyone's struggling to eat just because you have albinism. How do you feel about yourself, right? You feel it's your fault, right? And so the level of trauma is so deep and so pervasive that we realized we had to do some training. So we brought in a Christian psychologist from Hawaii who did it. He had a mission where he would go into developing countries and he would do seminars on trauma. And we would start doing seminars on trauma. And it was really cool because we'd get social workers, community leaders, government people, pastors, anybody who would come who dealt with people with albinism, medical community. And he would do it like a several-day seminar on trauma. And they had never understood the concept of trauma or thought about how it related to people with albinism. And so it was really cool to see even our staff themselves that had albinism who didn't even realize they were traumatized because they lived with it. So their whole life, this was just normal to them, right? And how trauma affected their ability to learn in school for students. And so we began to put a light on that. And we began to see a lot of kids healing where they could finally start talking about their experiences and normalizing them by talking to other people with albinism that had the same stories. We knew trauma was there, but the depth of it, became apparent as the years went on. And we're still dealing with it to this day. Like every time I go back to the country, I'm dealing with some of our students who are maybe in high school or university or whatever, and they're struggling. All of a sudden, they'll act into their grades will plummet. Their performance will go down because PTSD and other trauma-related disorders can create an inability to concentrate. It can create lack of sleep. It can create, and all of a sudden their academic performances drop. Well, why? Well, they all of a sudden begin to have traumatic memories, right? So the population of people with albinism are a traumatized people group, right?
What are you working on as an organization now that's interesting, compelling, exciting, that you feel like is very important? So what are the objectives going on for, say, the next 5-10 years?
Well, one of the things we're really excited about, we started an initiative a few years ago called the AAN, Africa Albinism Network. And so, I always joke with people when I started this thing back in 2008, I thought, here's this Canadian guy who's never been to Africa, doesn't know the language, doesn't know the culture. He's going to go over there and start this albinism NGO. And I said, so I went to the library and I got a book on how to start African albinism NGOs for dummies. Of course, being facetious, there was no such book. No one had ever done what we did. Never. Like literally never in the world once. And so I had nothing to follow. Good thing is I have an entrepreneurial background and I'm not afraid to make mistakes and take risks. So we made a lot of mistakes in the early years, tried a lot of things on that didn't work and muddled through. And I guess we realized that we figured it out. Like we know how to educate a culture. We know how to drop killings by 90%. We know how to make students successful. We have a system that works. We've proven it. We have the data to prove it. So then we said, there's like many, many other countries in the region that are having the same problem, the killings, the attacks, the discrimination. So one of my colleagues, Ike Ero, who's from Nigeria, lives in Canada, a Canadian citizen, has albinism, and she's a human rights lawyer. She works with us. And she led up the launch of the Africa Albinism Network. And one of the things that group is trying to do is to educate other countries in Africa about what we've done. So basically try and take the concepts that UTSS figured out and implemented and succeeded with and implement them in, a country like, Malawi or Kenya or Mozambique or Ghana or wherever it may be. And we're finding success. If you want to use a business model, you think of it as spreading a franchise, from one country to the next. Well, unfortunately, we don't have the funding to set up UTSS operations in those countries. It's just too costly. And we don't have that kind of funding. But what we can do is educate the albinism community. So often these countries will have small volunteer-based albinism support groups. So what we can do is go and educate the leaders of those groups on what we've done, how we've done it, to try and multiply the effects. And we've worked with African governments quite widely. We worked a lot at the UN, the African Union, Pan-African Parliament over the years, and got each country to begin to look at a national action plan on albinism. So the AAN is starting to do that work, and that's pretty exciting. We're kind of the people who've got a system here. Now we want to multiply it to other countries. So we're in the process of doing that.
That's great because, albinism is all over the world, as you said. And it sounds like Africa has a higher ratio. Maybe overall, I don't have the answers to that. But when I was on your site, I also was seeing a map of Africa as a total. Now, for everyone who's listening, remember Africa is a continent. There's more countries in Africa than any other continent. Looking at this map of where attacks have happened and especially discrimination, et cetera, it's like half of Africa.
Yes,
and it's a lot of territory to cover. And, so it's definitely something that's needed.
And each country has its own unique culture, its own languages, and some of the beliefs are a bit different culture to culture. But there's some common denominators we found. The common denominator is discrimination and the stigma and the prevalence of witchcraft, in many countries.
Yeah.
Man, thank you so much for being on the GoodViral podcast, Peter. We really appreciate you and your organization. And we're really wanting to encourage our listeners and watchers to take action. There's a link in the description wherever you're listening or watching this episode. Peter, what's that one place that you feel like most of our listeners and watchers should go to get more education and interest and be able to share to others?
Well, before I give you that, I'll just summarize by saying, if you're asking us the purpose of UTSS. Early on, I was sitting in my office in Vancouver when I was contemplating my first trip to Tanzania, making preparations. And I was thinking and praying about what is my purpose? What is our goal? What are we trying to achieve? What's our vision? And I would like your viewers to hear this and think about it, kind of summarize in a paragraph what we do. I have a dream one day that people with albinism will take their rightful place in every level of society, and the days of discrimination will one day be a faint memory. So that's why we exist. That's the whole reason this organization exists. And if you want to find out more about that, go to underthesamesun.com. We're there. We're also very active on Facebook. We're getting going now on Instagram. Educate yourself, become aware. And if you're able to make a contribution, we're a Canadian registered charity and an American registered charity. And so we exist because of the faithfulness of our supporters to change the kinds of lives I've already talked about with children with albinism, people with albinism. We save lives and we change lives. Just think a donation you give to us has a disproportionate impact. That's life-changing. So educate yourself and share. Once you learn, share it with others.
Absolutely. I really appreciate so much what you guys are doing, and I strongly believe that anybody out there who has it in their hearts to contribute, to donate, to become more involved and interested in this topic, like you say, it's life changing for people in a very direct way. And so again, thank you for your efforts. Thank you for joining us and sharing with us. This is a fascinating topic. I'm sure that most people like myself knew little or nothing. And now it's something that we can see as a very real thing in this planet. And so again, thank you for bringing this to the attention of so many people.
You're welcome. Glad to do it. Glad I could be here.
Thank you for listening to the GoodViral Podcast and being part of the conversation. If you are inspired by this episode, go to our website at goodviral.org, where you can find resources and listings from the episode to continue good efforts.
Like, comment, and share this episode to any or all of your social media channels. It's really easy to take a small action, and maybe you'll inspire a big result.
When good goes viral, the world gets better.